The tray arrived like a contradiction on a steel platter, steam curling from a roasted chicken leg, butter glistening on a cut of bread, crisp vegetables green as spring. And at the corner, a square of chocolate cake so dark it looked dangerous. Yuki's fingers wouldn't obey her. They hovered, trembled, retreated. The American guard, a woman barely older than Yuki, nudged the tray forward with a small, ordinary kindness that felt extraordinary in a world teaching that the enemy had horns. "It's yours," she said. Just that. No lectures. No years. The words landed with the softness of a blanket and the shock of a grenade. Around Yuki, other women stayed very still, as if motion itself might spring the trap. Months of stories crouched in their throats. Americans kept necklaces of teeth. Americans carved trophies from ears. Americans would not feed you, they would fatten you. Eyes moved from the food to the guard's face, from the guard's hands to the door, as though escape might still be wiser than trust. Someone's stomach betrayed her, growling so loudly that a few heads jerked in the sound's direction. Then Yuki lifted the fork. The chicken was warm, salty, ridiculously tender. Tear ducts, trained to drought by fear and hunger, surrendered at once. The first bite was disbelief, the second was grief, the third, a kind of surrender. No officer had ever meant surrender to the possibility that everything she'd been told might be wrong. The woman to Yuki's left began to cry, soundless sobs that shook her shoulders. Farther down the row, a nurse who had once stitched shrapnel wounds without anesthesia cradled her cake as carefully as a wounded bird. This is how the story opens, not with barbed wire and blows, but with a plate that smells like home in a place that isn't. In the room's stunned corridor of silence, a new question formed, heavier than any rifle. What happens when your enemy refuses to be the monster you need them to be? The camera, if we had one, would climb above the mess hall. Rows of women in ill-fitting issue coats, hair shorn, ragged at capture, or tied back in the utilitarian knots of field service, guards with clipboards and polite distance, a clock that ticks like any other clock in any other cafeteria. If we pulled back farther, we'd see rails that had brought them here. Tracks running like arteries across a continent they had imagined as a devourer of souls. We'd see a horizon with no ruins, no blackout curtains, no shrieking air raid sirens, only the square certainty of barracks and the thin winter trees waiting for a spring they can trust will arrive. But before trains and barracks, there were caves and hospitals and outposts. And all of them came preloaded with scripts written by people far from the front. If Americans take you, if they approach, embrace them with a grenade and vanish in fire. If they offer mercy, know that it is bait. The field service code Senjin-kun did not need to be present. It lived inside wrists and tongues. In the small stitches a mother placed in a daughter's hem to hide a capsule that could kiss the teeth and end the story with an obedient bitterness. That is why the cake is not cake. It is a wedge in the door, a draft of air in a sealed room. It is a first, ridiculous proof that reality has revoked the license of myth. This first reversal is the part that hurts the most, because it asks something terrifying, not endurance, not discipline, but the courage to edit yourself. Yuki had prepared to die in several directions. She'd rehearsed the reach for poison, the pull of a pin, the quick collapsing prayer to an emperor stitched into the very grammar of her childhood. No one had prepared her for a smiling enemy who ate a bite of his own ration to prove it wasn't poisoned, or for a medic who came with bandages outstretched rather than hands, or for the bureaucratic, almost boring efficiency of cataloging names and issuing blankets. Cruelty has a script. Kindness, in wartime, does not. It improvises. It confounds. What if it's a trick? A woman to Yuki's right whispered, eyes darting at the guards. This is the second question, the one that grips the back of the neck in the dark. If the enemy can act like a human being, then your leaders might have lied. If they lied about this, what else bends, breaks, or never existed? Belief is architecture. Change one load-bearing wall, and a house can groan. For the audience, us. Now, the introduction is a threshold. We will step through it together. We will walk from that tray to the ships that carried these women across a Pacific they had only known as a battlefield. We will stand at rail windows as columns of corn unspool, like green banners, and as city lights throw brazen constellations, no siren darkens. We will sit with them on examination tables, where doctors speak of vitamins as if health is an arithmetic you can solve with oranges and sun. We will count the routines of the camp reveille. Roll call. Soap that lathers hot water into clouds, and see how the ordinary can be the most radical miracle in a war. But first, linger. Notice the fork's weight in Yuki's hand. The stubborn training in her muscles that tells her to refuse, even as her body undoes that advice bite by bite. Notice the god's stance 2 steps back. Palms visible. A practiced, quiet choreography designed to make fear soften. Notice the other women learn by watching. The way one cautious swallow becomes permission for a dozen more. This is not absolution for anyone's sins in the Pacific. It is not a denial of atrocity elsewhere. It is not the tidy ending propaganda prefers. It is an inconvenient beginning. The story says, on Saipan and Okinawa, and in a dozen nameless rooms, women picked up forks and let something else in besides food. They tasted a future problem, the problem of living with the knowledge that the world is messier than any government pamphlet. You ask? As the tray slides back empty and shame loosens its grip just enough to let gratitude in. How do you rebuild a worldview shattered not by violence, but by tenderness? The answer is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small negotiations. Tonight you eat. Tomorrow you accept a blanket. Next week you say thank you and feel treason shiver through the syllables before it dissolves. Then one afternoon you actually laugh because an American has tried to write her name with your brush and turned it into a hilarious tangle. And that, somehow, is more frightening than a rifle ever was. Because it means the pronouns are changing. They blurs. We stretches. So we begin here, with an image you can carry in your pocket. A square of chocolate cake under a harsh light, sweating a little at the edges. Fragile as a truce. We begin with the tremor of a hand that chooses to believe the evidence of its tongue over the voice of its training. We begin at the edge of a long unlearning that will take these women from caves to cafeterias, from obedience to doubt, from certainty to something harder and braver, discernment. In the next movement of this story, we will set the stage that made such a tray unthinkable. The Emperor as God catechism of classrooms, the Senjinkun's steel syllables, the cartoons that put horns on enemies and halos on duty, the drills that turned mothers into quartermasters of poison. We will show how fear functions as policy, how myth weaponizes the imagination, how an island's cliffs became altars to an idea. Then we will return to the mess hall with new eyes and understand precisely why the chicken tasted, to Yuki, like blasphemy and salvation at once. For now, remember the face she made when sweetness hit a tongue that had forgotten it. History often begins this way, not with treaties or declarations, but with the quiet astonishment of a single human being discovering that the world she lives in has been wider the whole time, and that the first door into it was a simple word spoken without malice. It's yours. Before the tray and the cake, there was a catechism. It began in classrooms where portraits of the emperor hung like suns, and children bowed until foreheads nearly brushed their desks. Teachers spoke in the flat, unquestionable grammar of state. The emperor is divine, Japan is a sacred family, obedience is love. Morning drills trained more than bodies, they trained imagination. Geography lessons mapped a world in which Japan's destiny radiated outward. Ethics lessons braided duty to the throne with duty to die well. The lines between faith, patriotism, and fear blurred by design. By 1941, the Field Service Code, Senjin-kun, put this worldview into a soldier's pocket. Issued as a slim booklet, it was treated less like a manual than like scripture. Its message traveled farther than trenches. Parents paraphrased it to daughters who worked in munitions depots and field hospitals. Never lived to experience the shame of capture. It warned. Shame wasn't personal, it was cosmic. To be taken alive didn't just stain you, it stained the ancestors who watched and the children yet unborn. In a culture that prized self-mastery, death could be framed as the ultimate proof of control. The propaganda that supported this ethic was not amateur. Posters rendered Americans with grotesque caricatures. Jutting teeth, goggled eyes, hands that clutched at women. Radio dramas leaned close to the ear with stories of villages despoiled and bodies mutilated. Children's storybooks gave the monster a name Yankee and a shape they could color inside the lines. Newsreels looped victories and edited defeats into cautionary tales of what awaited anyone who faltered. The rumors did the heaviest lifting. Whispered inventories of trophies, Americans supposedly took ears. Teeth. Noses moved through markets and barracks as if notarized by experience. Women absorbed all of this with an added dread. The home front's rhetoric exalted purity and sacrifice. The battlefield's training grafted those ideals onto flesh. Nurses learned to keep a final option near the tongue. Communications clerks rehearsed the choreography of embracing a grenade should a perimeter collapse. Mothers stitched small interior pockets into kimonos, the size and shape of a bitter pebble, and practiced calmly, lovingly how a daughter's fingers might find them. The message was consistent. Your body is not the enemy's to claim. If capture comes, choose disappearance over defilement. Fear's utility was simple. A soldier who believes there is no tolerable life beyond the line will hold it longer. A civilian convinced that surrender is worse than death will not complicate logistics by fleeing or yielding. This is how a high command facing material inferiority can attempt to buy time with convictions. On islands like Saipan and later Okinawa, that calculus became visible at the cliff's families, hounded by shells and stories, choosing gravity over the enemy's outstretched hand. It was tragedy, but it was also policy. The terrible proof that messaging had become muscle memory. Across the water, dehumanization ran in the other direction too. Allied propaganda painted Japanese fighters as fanatics. Vermin, a swarm to be burned or blasted, not individuals to be understood. On battlefields from Bataan to Guadalcanal, the ferocity of combat and the brutality inflicted on Allied prisoners imprinted a desire for vengeance. The Pacific War's spiral was not symmetrical in every place or moment, but it shared one engine with every total war. Make the other side less than human, so killing becomes logistics. Into this furnace of depiction stepped a competing structure: international law. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Its manuals and training reflected obligations that, while imperfectly enforced, existed as institutional rails registries. Mail, rations, medical care, work rules. Japan's relationship to POW conventions was more limited, and practice in many theaters departed from restraint. These differences mattered less as abstractions than as outcomes. They were the unglamorous paperwork that, later, would materialize for Japanese captives as blankets, head counts, clinics, and rules that did not change with a guard's mood. Context also means economy. By 1944, shortages inside Japan were not propaganda, but air in the lungs. Rice rationed, fish scarce, fruit a dream. Cities cratered by nightly alarms. Children learn to tell the difference between the whine of a single-engine fighter and the drone of a bomber, the way farm kids once learned to read clouds. Civil defense drilled and drilled. Darkness became patriotic. Luxury is, the enemy was more than a slogan, it was a self-portrait of survival. To be told that Americans gorged themselves while bombing from abundance fit neatly into hunger's sense of justice. And then there was religion. Not in the narrow sense of churches, but in the broad sense of meaning. State Shinto framed the nation as a sacred organism with the emperor at its heart. A lineage of gods made flesh. In such a frame, surrender was not bad strategy. It was metaphysical treason. The private grief of a family whose son laid down arms could be transfigured by public ritual into communal contamination. Funerals were sometimes held for living prisoners. A logic so severe it could only be borne by people convinced the alternative was worse. Add to this the psychology of escalation. Every month the war continued. More blood tied both sides to their narratives. If you have paid dearly, you lean harder on the story that redeemed the price. If your losses mount, moderation can begin to look like betrayal. Leaders understand this. They groom it. So when a commander told a ward of nurses to swallow poison if captured, it wasn't sadism, but a grim attempt to keep a system coherent, a nation at bay. Watching the industrial maw of an adversary asks people to become ideas. All of which is why the first American medic who lifted both hands and said, haltingly, "Doctor, help them," sounded like a heresy. The script said there would be jeering and violation, not deference to a woman's skill. The training said mercy was camouflage. The rumors said food was bait. Water dozed. Smiles a prelude to harm. That gap, the chasm between expectation and encounter, is the drama at the heart of this story. 1,000 pamphlets had instructed these women how to die. Not one had prepared them for a regimen of rules. Signatures and injections meant to keep them alive. The comparative lens clarifies further. Axis prisoners in camps across America, German and Italian men often worked local farms, played music, wrote letters under censorship, and experienced a paradox. Humane captivity inside a war that elsewhere shredded bodies without ceremony. For Japanese women expecting the Pacific's ferocity to follow them into the cage. The discovery of those same rails was destabilizing. International law may feel dry on a page. In a barracks, it can feel like a revolution. Propaganda thrives on distance. It needs you to never meet the person it's describing. It relies on the long echo, the rumor that cannot be safely tested. The Senjin-kun and the classroom portrait and the whispered they wear necklaces of teeth were all distance machines. The mess hall tray was a distance killer. You cannot hold the fork and stay entirely inside the old country. Your hand has crossed the border, even if your mind lingers at the checkpoint. Papers clutched, unwilling to move. This, then, is the architecture behind the shock. A society spun from devotion, fear, and hunger, a pocket code that sacralized death, a rumor mill that built cages more binding than iron, an enemy doing the exact same imaginative violence in reverse, and running like a quiet counter-melody. The plodding, bureaucratic music of international rules. Understanding this lattice is essential before we watch it collapse under the weight of a single, impossible kindness. We do not excuse anything by describing it. We empower memory to make finer distinctions. And those distinctions between belief and truth, between myth and encounter, are the thread we will follow as we move from caves to cargo holds, from blackout curtains to city lights, from a capsule sewn into a hem to a spoon dipped into oatmeal under a fluorescent hum. They were captured in different ways. But the first sensation was always noise, the metallic chorus of bolts drawn back, the thud of boots, the bark of an order in a language that struck the ear like hail. On Saipan, the field hospital's canvas quaked while shells stitched the ground. Sachiko's commander shoved a final instruction between explosions. Remember your duty. Her thumb found the hard little certainty of the poison sewn into her pocket. The door flew inward. Men filled the doorway like a moving wall, and then a single American with a red cross on his sleeve stepped forward. Palms open, eyebrows raised in a question that pierced the script. "Doctor," he said, tapping his chest clumsily. He pointed at a groaning Japanese soldier. Then, at the floor beside him. "Not me. Him." Sachiko's index finger hovered over the capsule. It did not move. On Okinawa, Kiko tucked herself into the skittish lungs of a cave. The air tasted of damp stone and old smoke. She could hear Americans outside. The crunch of gravel. A low voice. A canteen cap threading shut. The stories throbbed in her head, trophies taken. Women passed around like contraband. When a Marine's silhouette darkened the opening, her vision shrank to a pinhole. He crouched, set a tin-wrapped rectangle on the ground, and withdrew. She watched it like it might explode. When she didn't move, he returned, tore the paper, broke off a square, ate it, and smiled. The smell reached her a second later, sweetness dressed in cocoa. She crawled toward it as if toward a memory. In a radio shack on a smaller island whose name the maps barely bothered to print, Yumiko and 3 other women huddled under a desk while Boots explored the building like blind hands. The door swung, light slashed in, and a shadow approached with something held forward. Yumiko shut her eyes, braced. When she opened them, the thing hovering an inch from her face was a packet of crackers. The American said something she didn't understand, and then performed the pantomime of peace. He broke one, ate, chewed, swallowed, and waited. Yumiko discovered how fast a throat could relearn. Capture fractured the world. What followed stitched it into a shape no one had rehearsed. From island pens, the women moved to ships. Great, gray-bellied vessels that smelled of oil, rope, and salt. They expected holds like tombs. A air you had to cut and drink. Instead, a narrow corridor of bunks greeted them. 3 tiers stacked like syllables. Mattress, sheet, blanket. A young corpsman with soft freckles on a hard face offered each woman a small white tablet that dissolved nausea into something manageable. "Seasick," he said, wincing the way people do when they wish their words wore better shoes. The ship was neither paradise nor hell. It was profoundly regulated. Bells marked time, not with danger, but with duty. Men with armbands made lists. Names became numbers, then returned to names as an interpreter, Japanese-American. Careful, tired, moved down the line, verifying pronunciations, as if pronunciation were a kind of respect. Breakfast the first morning set the ship whispering. Eggs, their yolks scandalously golden. Bread that wanted butter and got it. Coffee that smelled like the story of a city. Yuki cupped her mug with both hands like a shrine. For a year she had eaten hunger flavored with duty. Now she learned that bitterness had another career. She watched an American private eat the same food she did. Shoulder to shoulder with a corporal who, between bites, tapped a wedding ring against enamel. A tiny bell of home. The distance between enemy and man measured itself in unremarkable motions. A napkin wiped. A chair scraped. A joke muttered and answered with a grin. Illness, for once, did not equal disposal. Fumiko, who had been swallowing bile since the dock receded, was sure that any moment a god would nudge her toward a rail and gesture to the sea. Instead, a doctor with careful hands and a tired stethoscope returned again and again, laying down a regimen like a path. Fluids, rest. Something chalky for the stomach that clung to the tongue like a vow. He checked her eyes the way carpenters check a beam, looking not for poetry but for soundness. when she slept at last. She dreamed of her mother pressing a cool cloth to her forehead in a summer before war. The Pacific's 2-week roll rewired expectations with the patience of waves. Afternoons brought inspections and the quiet tyranny of hygiene. Wash basins, thin towels, soap that made the water talk. Even the indignity of head lice, that intimate soldier of poverty, was addressed with powder and combs rather than scorn. A woman with a hacking cough was moved to a corner screened by canvas and visited like a clock. The absurd novelty of this attention did not breed gratitude at once. It bred suspicion first, because if kindness is a net, better to see its knots. But nets catch fish. This caught doubt. Approaching the American coast, the ship turned rumor into scenery. San Francisco rose like a complicated promise, its hills layered with houses that had never learned the language of rubble. The bridges looked like arithmetic in the sky, for women whose nights had been ruled by drills. The audacity of light made them flinch. Electric bulbs burned without apology. Stores flung color at the street from behind glass. Oranges piled like suns. Tins of peaches with labels that blushed. "It's not war here," Yumiko whispered. Not quite accusation. Not quite envy. Trains shouldered the next distance, stitching ports to inland camps with steel thread. They rode in passenger cars, seats like small upholstered Mercies, windows wide as a cinema. Snow arrived at the glass like a rumor of another planet. The Rockies lifting their white flags as if surrender could look like majesty. In the plains, corn marched to the horizon in green legions. Wheat shimmered like a soft-spoken army. Ko stared until her eyes watered. "There is enough to feed everyone," she thought. A sentence so large it frightened her. Camps did not hide their bars. Fences carried their own vocabulary. Roll call, counts, zones, curfews. But fences also have insides. And these contained a logic that contradicted the women's fear without pretending to erase it. Entry meant a new ritual, cataloging, delousing, vaccination. A nurse with hair the color of straw and hands that never quite stopped moving guided them to benches, to scales, to cuffs that kissed biceps and squeezed. A dentist frowned at Midori's gums and murmured about vitamins as if the alphabet could save a mouth. A doctor, hearing the bell in Haruko's chest, invoked a word no one had expected to hear. Streptomycin. Medicine as incantation, medicine as proof that an enemy might prefer you living. Clothes arrived in piles. Cotton, underthings. Socks that hugged calves. Coats too big that became, within an hour, bearable. Then, comforting. The barracks received them with the smell of wood warmed by bodies. With aisles of iron cots. With small lockers that clicked shut like a promise. Yuki ran her palm along a blanket with the greedy wonder of a child in a fabric shop. In Tokyo, she had slept on straw and newsprint that announced other people's fortunes. Here, a wool rectangle declared, without drama. That heat could be controlled. Rules lived everywhere, pinned to bulletin boards. Spoken slowly by interpreters. Enforced by repetition rather than spectacle. Work was explained not as punishment, but as a system humming. Needing hands. Kitchens where knives could make harmony instead of harm. Laundries where steam turned uniforms into obedient rectangles. Gardens where seeds made quiet empires. A notice informed them that older women would have lighter duties, pregnant women, rest and extra milk. The sentence might as well have been written in a dialect of mercy. Suspicion did not evaporate. It migrated. It looked for new footholds and found only procedures. It tested the food for poison and found only salt. It waited for night to bring the other face of the camp and found only the dull intimacy of sleep. Some women gripped their fear like a relic, a proof that honor still lived where obedience failed. Others felt the first hairline cracks in certainty and pressed their tongues to the edges like children worrying loose teeth. Interpreters Nisei in crisp uniforms became bridges with boots. They were disorienting. Faces that could have belonged to cousins. Mouths that shaped English with ease and Japanese with careful respect. They explained head counts, ration cards, the library, mail. Letters would move like birds across ocean and wire. Censored, but alive. The very possibility made some women ache with a new, complicated pain. Hope must be carried carefully, or it will bruise. Evening in the first week brought a small, almost comic ceremony. A demonstration of how to operate the showers. A guard blushed the color of a boiled beet and fled, replaced by a nurse who explained modesty screens and schedules, then left them alone with hot water that pinned shoulders down and lifted grief up. Steaming. They laughed high, startled notes ricocheting off tile because their bodies remembered this language better than their minds did. Capture had been loud. Transport had been measured. Intake was a bureaucracy disguised as a welcome, and a welcome disguised as bureaucracy. By the time the first lights out descended, 10 p.m., a bell, a hush, patrolled more by habit than menace. Many of the women lay awake, eyes wide in the dark, listening for the delayed arrival of terror. It did not come. Instead, across the barracks, someone breathed in time with someone else. And, as if in reply, a third found the rhythm. A camp sleeps the way a ship sails together. Or not at all. Toward morning, Yuki finally slid under. The blanket, a topography of safety she did not yet trust. The taste of chocolate still somewhere in the country of her mouth. A passport to a land she had not known existed. Tomorrow would bring work assignments and instructions for recreation, a word that sounded decadent, and a posted list of classes. But tonight brought only this. The bewildering mercy of a day that violated every story she had been told about enemies, and the dawning dread that the war she now had to fight would be against the empire in her head. The days arranged themselves like neat drawers. Reveille's bell, bunks squared to regulation, steam rising from tin mugs, a flag climbing a pole while breath ghosted in morning air. Order can be a kindness when your life has been chaos. But for these women, order first felt like a mask. The mind, trained to expect cruelty, tried to locate it inside the routine. A schedule surely was only a rhythm to make the blow land clean. Still, the body made its own decisions. Hot water loosened shoulders the way apologies loosen grudges. Soap, real soap, turned to clouds between palms. The starch stink of uniforms gave way to the warm smell of kitchens, where onions met butter and surrendered. Yuki caught herself humming while scrubbing a pot the size of a drum. The sound startled her, as if a stranger had stepped out of her mouth and waved. Work assignments came stapled to the logic of strength. Older women folded towels in a sunlit room that smelled faintly of bleach. The youngest hauled crates of carrots and onions to the mess. The nimble-fingered found their way into the mending shop where ripped elbows and blown seams recommitted themselves to duty. Haruko, a former teacher with an English vocabulary picked up from dog-eared readers, was dispatched to the library, where paper touched paper like a secret handshake. She labeled spines with careful block letters, then clutched a grammar book to her chest as if it were contraband. There were rules. But there was also slack built into them, room where Mercy could put down a chair. Go. 8 months along, and carrying her fear low and heavy. Was told her job was to rest and drink an extra glass of milk. The order embarrassed her. It felt like a demotion from endurance itself. Then, the camp doctor, a quiet man who wore exhaustion like a second shirt, sat on the edge of her cot and said, in halting Japanese learned from a phrase book, 2 heartbeats. Both important. She cried in a way that cleaned the room. Suspicion needed oxygen. and the camp's design accidentally starved it. Food arrived not as largesse, but as pattern. Breakfast, oats, eggs, bread. Lunch, soup. A sandwich, fruit that glowed like small lanterns. Dinner, meat or beans, potatoes, greens. Sometimes a pudding that jiggled like laughter. The first week, many women hid crusts beneath their mattresses, hedging against the day the trick would reveal itself. After the first month, the crusts disappeared, eaten or trusted back into the system, and the hiding places smelled only of wool. Free time came as a provocation. What kind of enemy lets you be idle? At first, the hours were padded with vigilance, watching guards, watching the clock, watching the sky for the bad news of planes. But boredom is a bridge no propaganda knows how to burn. Midori wandered into an art hour organized by a Red Cross worker and an American guard with sleeves rolled to the elbow. The guard set down a dented tin of colored pencils with a flourish. "Use," she said, tapping the tin. Midori drew her mother's kitchen from memory. The bamboo strainer, the nicked cutting board, the stove with its temperamental throat. When the guard leaned over the drawing, she recognized the cut of the board, the practical economy of a room that could belong anywhere. "My mother's looks like this," the guard said, and for a second, the word "my" reached across the fence and found an echo. Language classes formalized what the yard had already started. In a barracks mess room cleared of tables, an Issei interpreter, Sergeant Ito, taught "hello, please, thank you," hands painting meaning in the air. The women repeated the words like steps in a dance. Errors ricochetted, produced grins, then outright giggles as consonants collided with unfamiliar teeth. The sergeant switched roles after an hour, asking for Japanese in return. A chalkboard filled with kana, guarded by the serious joy of shared risk. The first time an American god bowed correctly. A gust of applause went up, not for cultural accuracy, but for intent made visible. The exchanges multiplied in small, domestic ways. Yuki noticed the American cook boiling rice like potatoes. She could not let the crime continue. "Wash," she said, miming water over grain, fingers sifting, draining, measuring. He tried again, and the rice remembered its better self. In return, he taught her apple pie how to keep butter cold, how to cut fat into flour until it looked like coarse sand, how to lay the crust across a dish without tearing its fragile geography. They cut steam slits like little stars. When the pie cooled, the cook carved thin slices and handed them around with the solemnity of communion. Cinnamon announced itself like an old friend you didn't know you had. The library became a border crossing for the mind. Books in Japanese arrived courtesy of the Red Cross. Poetry with its careful rein. Dictionaries with their stubborn gates. A few novels that had survived many hands. Haruko organized a reading circle under a posted map of the United States. They read Basho's travel sketches and then lifted their eyes to study the rail lines that had brought them here, tracing with fingertips the routes they might one day reverse. An American nurse, Mary Thompson, hovered at the edge, half invited, half shy. Haruko patted the bench beside her. "Sit," she said. By December, Mary could recite a haiku with a Midwestern lilt that made everyone smile. Kindness felt dangerous anyway. The first time Fumiko laughed. Really laughed, because Mary's brushstrokes had turned the character for River into something that looked alarmingly like a fence, with legs gilt shot through her like an alarm. She stopped, hand to mouth. "If you laugh with an enemy, what does that make you? If you are warmed by their blanket, what happens to the promise you made at the cliff's edge?" Honor argued with survival in long, late-night sessions no witness could record. "Today I should have died," she thought on hard nights. In the morning, the sun returned like an unasked question, and the smell of coffee still foreign. Still tempting nudged the answer toward life. Not everyone crossed the bridge at the same pace. One woman, Akemi, rationed her sentences like precious metal and watched the guards with a look meant to strike sparks. When she fell ill with fever, she tried to refuse treatment. No experiments, she rasped. The nurse stepped back, removed her gloves slowly. He named each item in her tray. Let Akemi touch the thermometer. Feel the tick of her own pulse through the blood pressure cuff. Just numbers. The nurse said, and then, softer, just you. The fever broke 2 days later, and Akemi thanked no one. But when the nurse passed her bunk a week after, Akemi's hand lifted an inch in the air and fell a salute from someone not yet ready to call it that. Christmas came with paper chains and a scraggly tree coaxed into cheer. The camp invited the women. Curiosity beat caution by a nose. They sang carols on phonograph records, melodies that felt like snow even to those who had never seen it, and then the women took a turn, folding cranes at a long table, teaching clumsy American hands to make wings out of stubborn paper. The camp commander's daughter, pink-cheeked, gap-toothed, vowed to fold 1,000. For peace. Haruko told her, for peace. The girl repeated, as if the word were a marble to be pocketed and shown to friends. The birthday that Fumiko did not intend to mention found her anyway. Mary the nurse appeared with a cake architected from rations and ingenuity. Crushed crackers, softened with canned milk. Chocolate shaved from a bar. A candle whittled from a stub of wax. For my daughter, far away, Mary said, placing it down. And for you? Fumiko's instinct was to refuse, then to accept, then to apologize for accepting. Instead, she lit the candle with a match Mary struck. And in the small golden circle of light, both women saw a room not patrolled by fences. The true climax in these camps was not a riot or an escape. It was quieter and more radical. The pronouns rearranged themselves. They fractured into a set of names. The enemy acquired hobbies. Clumsy handwriting. A mother who raised chickens. A brother who hated peacetime shoes. And for the Americans, the Japanese stopped being a swarm of uniforms and became Haruko, who annotated grammar books. Yuki, who could make rice shine. Ko, who carried 2 heartbeats. This did not absolve war. It did not rewrite the ledger of cruelty elsewhere. But it did something no leaflet could do. It made the imagination treasonous to hatred. That treason would have consequences later in letters home. In jobs taken during the occupation. In the way a woman spoke to her child about people on the other side of an ocean. For now, it lived in small, daily courage. The courage to say thank you and survive the sting of shame. The courage to teach your captor how to bow. The courage to admit that reality had out-argued myth without asking you to abandon your dead. Night by night, the camp taught an unglamorous heroism. To accept mercy without surrendering memory. To practice discernment where doctrine had demanded purity. The women learned slowly, unevenly, that kindness did not require permission from the past. They learned, too, that to see the humanity of an enemy does not erase your own. It restores it. And in that restoration, a different kind of victory took root. Quiet as breath. Steady as the rhythm of boots at morning roll call. Ordinary as the way hands share a pie knife. Plate. Slice. Pass. Until what you remember most about that day is not the fence. Not the guard. But the simple miracle of warm cinnamon in cold air. August 15, 1945, arrived inside the camp as a ripple that became a wave. Word moved faster than the posted schedules. Radio now. Women drifted toward the recreation hut as if pulled by a tide. The set was small. The sound tinny. A guard adjusted the antenna until the static thinned, and a voice, formal and oddly distant, entered the room. Many of the women had never heard it before. The Emperor's... There was nothing triumphal in the cadence. Only a carefully measured sorrow. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. The Japanese phrases archaic. Ceremonial seemed to fall through the wood floor and keep falling. Some women dropped to their knees. Others stood rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. One pressed both palms to her ears and still heard it. Surrender! The room held several griefs at once. Relief that bombing would stop. Shame that the God King had yielded. Fear for parents in cities described by rumor as scorched maps. The guards did not interrupt. After the speech, they rolled in a cart of newspapers. The front pages were crowded with pictures from Hiroshima and Nagasaki flattened neighborhoods. A horizon that looked like a continent of ash. A sergeant who had guarded them for months set the papers down without flourish, his jaw working as if on a tough piece of thought. "I'm sorry," he said, to no one in particular. There was no gloating to push against. Only the scale of damage. Too large for anger to organize. News changed the air in the camp overnight. Orders that had sounded like permanence took on the brittle tone of the temporary. Repatriation became a word with weight. Lists appeared. Manifests for ships. Embarkation dates. Medical checks required before departure. A bulletin board that had taught the rules of survival now taught how to leave. In the barracks, women began to fold possessions into piles, small enough to be carried, the several letters allowed. A book pressed on them by the librarian. A scarf. A photograph that had served all this time as proof of a life beyond fences. With dates came another dread. Returning would require a new courage. To re-enter a homeland that had instructed them to die rather than be captured. "I am more afraid of home than I was of the enemy," Haruko admitted to Mary, the nurse who had taught her to prefer precise verbs. The fear had practical branches. Would families take them back? Would neighbors spit? Would a prospective employer read POW into their faces and see only failure? Some had heard of funerals held for the captured. What ceremony does a village perform when the dead walks up the road? The Americans tried to answer with information rather than assurance. A briefing officer, bookish, careful, stood beneath a chalkboard map of Japan and described conditions awaiting them. Food shortages, ration lines, black markets blooming like weeds in rubble, the Supreme Commander's early occupation policies, the disbanding of the army, the new currency regimes, a stern ban on carrying contraband home. He could not brief the shame out of a culture. Only note that change in law, in policy, in the shape of daily life, was coming fast. For some women, the months in camp had created unexpected leverage. English lessons and typing practice, library shifts and kitchen work had built muscles that would matter in a retooling country. One by one, a few received offers not to stay. Policy rarely allowed that. But to return with letters of introduction to offices staffed by Americans and by Japanese fluent in the new bureaucracies of the occupation. Your experience may help rebuild, Sergeant Ito told Haruko, handing her a folded paper. Bridges need people who can carry 2 languages at once. Partings were not dramatic. They were threaded with chores. Vaccination lines formed. Medical staff certified that the women were fit to cross oceans. The dental officer worked through lunch to finish fillings that would not be possible in ruined cities anytime soon. In the mess, the cook slipped recipe cards written in a lopsided hand into Yuki's pocket. How to make a pie with poor flour. How to stretch a stew without cheating the tongue. The camp commander's daughter arrived with a string of cranes. She had fallen short of 1,000. But her wish was already granted by the radio. Take them, she said to Ko, tucking the paper birds over the swelling slope of her belly. For both, departure cracked open a private ledger of debts. Women prepared thank yous they did not know how to pronounce without feeling betrayal draft at their backs. Some wrote letters to gods who had never given their last names. Some left small gifts. A folded fan made of butcher paper. A calligraphed character for spring. A knitted cuff salvaged from an old sweater and cleverly resewn. Mary handed Fumiko a soft-covered notebook. Blank pages for whatever came next. Write it down while it's fresh, she said. Memory fades faster than you think. The voyage home was not a mirror of the trip out. The sea was the same sea. But the women leaned against the railings with different faces. They spoke softly of how to present themselves, how to explain. Some rehearsed lies for neighbors who demanded heroics. Others decided that a plain story would be armor enough. A few wondered, uncomfortably, whether the camp had made them soft. I am fat with kindness, Yumiko said with a crooked grin, pinching an inch of proof at her waist. Then she fell quiet, thinking about ration cards and the thin wrists she would soon see in breadlines. Disembarkation introduced them to the geometry of defeat. Ports had scars. Warehouses leaned. A queue for rice wrapped a city block twice. The line did not move so much as eddy. American MPs stood on corners with a posture that read order and occupation in equal fonts. The first walk through familiar streets hurt in a way the women had not anticipated. Smells were both home and not home. Smoke, sewage, fish, dust. All singing in a register war had tuned. Reception varied like weather. One woman's mother ran to meet her, screaming her name as if hauling her back from a cliff she had stood on for a year. Another's aunt kept her hands still and asked, in a voice like a ledger, "Why didn't you do your duty?" A neighbor's sideways glance lodged like a splinter. A father wrote, "Buddha be thanked you live" in the first letter he managed to send after the mail creaked back to life. The country contained both judgments. And the women learned the skill of navigating neighborhoods the way soldiers learn to read terrain. Work became the next battlefield, and sometimes the balm. Those with English found desks in offices where the occupation government and Japanese agencies touched. Translation pools. Logistics bureaus. The new education ministry drafting modern curricula. Haruko corrected memos written by young American officers who thought they were writing to a country like their own. She inserted honorifics where respect demanded them, excised ones that had bound children to obedience, and smuggled nuance into sentences weighed down by certainties. Fumiko, whose hands had learned to fly over keys in the camp, typed for a newspaper that aimed to tell truths the war had buried. She took dictation from reporters who were still learning the line between censorship and necessity. Their existence complicated propaganda on both shores. In Japan, their testimony, when they dared give it, contradicted the lurid hellscapes that wartime rumor had erected. In the United States, guards and nurses carried home stories that refused the easy script of a faceless enemy. A farm boy from Iowa who had learned to bow off center now corrected friends who said Japs over coffee. Mary kept the calligraphed spring above her sink for years. A small rebuke to the part of the country that preferred its enemies simple. There was a broader architecture to all this, beyond individual kindness. Geneva compliance had been more than morality. It was strategy. Treating prisoners humanely paid dividends that do not fit neatly in a ledger, undercutting enemy propaganda. Encouraging surrender that saved lives on both sides. Seeding post-war reconciliation. The women's stories also insisted on a parallel truth. Humane treatment in one theater does not erase atrocities in another. Complexity is not exculpation. It is an obligation to keep the record whole. Years peeled away. The cranes yellowed. Babies were born into a country that wrote new laws for women, new protections for workers, new civic rituals that did not require obeisance to a portrait. Some of the former prisoners taught classrooms of children whose textbooks contained no demons with horns. A few traveled, decades later, to America as tourists. riding buses through cities they had seen once. Through chain link, they looked for the camp and found a warehouse instead. Or a suburb. Or a field. What remained was not a building but a practice. The discipline of recognizing another's humanity before a uniform tries to erase it. If there is a historical significance to their path, it is this: mercy can be policy, and policy can be mercy. Humane systems are not soft. They are hard-won infrastructures that hold when tempers fail. These women learned that lesson with a cost no syllabus should require. When asked late in life what moment signaled the change, many did not cite the radio or the papers full of ash. They remembered small things. A guard eating a square of chocolate first. A doctor saying, 2 heartbeats. Both important. The first time their own mouth formed thank you and did not taste of betrayal. Out of such stitches, a different post-war fabric was made, coarse at first, then stronger, capable of holding more truth than any banner ever could. Begin where the world first cracked. A square of chocolate cake sweating under hard light. A fork hovering like a question. Years pass, and Yuki still remembers the exact weight of that fork, as if mercy itself had mass. When she tells the story later to a granddaughter who cannot imagine blackout curtains or pockets sewn for poison, she does not start with emperors or edicts. She starts with taste. It was sweet, she says. And that was the first treason. I had been loyal to bitterness. The child laughs. Certain it's a joke. But Yuki shakes her head. Sweetness is an argument you can't refute in words. The cake was only the first hinge. There were others. A wool blanket that made sleep something other than a battle. A nurse who measured fever like a carpenter measures wood. Not to judge, but to fix. A guard who bent imperfectly at the waist and called it a bow. 1,000 cranes folded by small American hands for a wish that, for once, did not choose a side. None of these erased the war. They contradicted something else, the totalizing story that says enemies are ideas, not people, and that the only safe response to a monster is to become one yourself. The women discovered one awkward kindness at a time. That propaganda's first victim is flexibility. Dehumanization welds the mind shut. Humane treatment pries the seam just enough for air to enter. In that draft, discernment wakes up. Not naivete discernment. It is the small, courageous act of noticing what is in front of you, even when it threatens what you have believed behind you. For Yuki and Haruko and Yumiko and Co., this was not a slogan. It was nightly work. It felt like betrayal of the dead to say thank you to a guard. It felt like abandoning a nation to accept a doctor's care. But they did it. And the trend line of their souls bent toward complexity. This is the lesson that outlived fences. Mercy can be both a policy and a posture. As policy, it looks like the dumb beauty of rules, the Geneva rails that keep a camp from becoming a private empire of any one man's temper. As posture, it looks like a cook who learns to wash rice properly because a prisoner showed him how. Or a nurse who takes off her gloves so a sick woman can touch the tools and name them. Policy without posture calcifies into box ticking. Posture without policy burns out or breaks. Together, they become an architecture strong enough to carry people across their worst hours without snapping. There is a second lesson. Quieter and riskier. Recognizing the humanity of your enemy does not bleach the record of their crimes, nor yours. It makes the record readable. After the war, some wanted a single narrative, pure victimhood or pure villainy, because single narratives are easy to carry and simple to teach. But the women's lives refused flatness. They had been raised inside a system that asked them to die on command. They had been fed rumors that replaced faces with fangs. They had been prepared to shatter themselves like glass if captured. Then they met a bureaucracy of care that insisted, despite uniforms and fences, that their lives were not forfeit. Which is true. All of it. History is a braid, Pull one strand and you don't get truth, you get less rope. Yuki lives long enough to visit America once. Decades later, the camp is gone, paved over by commerce and convenience. But in a museum, she finds the same dented model of canteen she once refused to drink from. The same mess tray with its neat partitions. She laughs at the tray, embarrassed by the rush of reverence she feels for a rectangle of stamped metal. In a bookstore, she buys a blank notebook and writes down what the tray had argued without words. The enemy fed me. I did not deserve it. I accepted it anyway. I was wrong about them. I was wrong about myself. I lived. Haruko's classroom becomes a small laboratory where this knowledge replicates. She teaches English, yes, but smuggles in something sturdier. When a student parrots a slur picked up from an uncle who drinks his dinners, she asks for a story instead. Tell me one person you mean, she says. The student cannot, and the word withers under the light of specificity. Names defeat caricatures the way a map defeats rumor. Not by eloquence, but by detail. Who is the most dangerous question you can arm a child with? Mary keeps the calligraphed character for spring above her sink until the paper curls at the corners and the ink fades to smoke. She raises children who know how to bow off-center in a way that isn't quite right and is entirely sincere. When her son nearly enlists for a different war years later, they talk not about glory, but about systems, about the hard discipline of treating captives decently even when you are angry enough to chew iron. We are measured by what we do when we have power over someone, she says. And she is right. And what of those who never crossed the inner border? Who stayed loyal to the old fear? Their stories belong too. Not everyone finds their way out of a room when the door opens. Trauma prefers the familiar. Shame nails furniture to the floor. One woman refused medicine to the end and died not of an experiment, but of a fever that could have been lowered by a pill and trust. Her death is also part of the ledger, the cost of a system that trained her to see kindness as camouflage. The line from mess hall to present is short. Our century wears different uniforms, but tells old lies with new fonts. It is still profitable to make a stranger monstrous. Still convenient to sell certainty to the frightened. Still easy to confuse vengeance with justice and speed with truth. Humane treatment of captives can feel, in such a climate, like softness or treason. It is neither. It is strategy against the corrosion of the soul. It is an investment in the world you must inhabit after the shooting stops. And it is, if you care about victory that lasts longer than a headline, a cheat code against the propaganda that recruits the next war. So we end where we began, in the territory of taste and touch. The wool that didn't itch, the pie crust that flaked, the pencil that left a satisfying graphite shine, the crane whose wings held a clumsy crease and still looked like hope. These are small things, beneath the notice of treaties and monuments. And precisely for that reason, they last. When the women tried to describe what saved them from hardening into statues of their own grief, they did not cite speeches. They named gestures, a hand steadying a cup. A word pronounced badly on purpose, because trying is another name for respect. Which courage is harder, the kind that stands its ground, or the kind that revises it? Fighting is dramatic, rethinking is quiet. One can make you a hero in an afternoon, the other makes you a grown-up inch by inch. Maybe the answer is that both are required, but not at the same time. In the camps, the women learned a choreography their training had never set to music. Resist where you must. Relent where you can. And never let a uniform, yours or theirs, do your seeing for you. If you carry anything out of this story, let it be the discipline of the fork in a trembling hand. Test what you're told against what you can taste. Ask who, not just what, and when you find yourself holding power over anyone, Remember that mercy is not a leak in the dam, it is the dam. It holds the river until the flood of anger recedes and the bridge downstream can be built. Then cross it, one deliberate step at a time, into a future large enough for truth, grief, and the ordinary miracle of people who refuse to be monsters for each other.